Hey there! How's it going? Thanks for joining me today. Whether you're relaxing at home, on your commute, or winding down for the evening, I'm really glad you're here. Today I want to tell you about one of the most incredible stories from World War II that almost nobody knows about. It's a story about a small, peaceful country that made perhaps the most radical decision in military history. And here's the crazy part. It wasn't about winning a war. It was about making sure that even if they lost, their enemies would get absolutely nothing for their trouble. Picture this moment with me. It's July 25th, 1940. The place is a meadow called Rütli in Switzerland, IPP, and this isn't just any meadow. This is where Swiss democracy was born, where the founding fathers of Switzerland first gathered centuries ago. It's sacred ground. And on this summer day, General Henri Guisan, the commander-in-chief of the Swiss military, is standing before his assembled officers with something unthinkable to tell them. Now, imagine you're one of those officers. You've served your country faithfully. You've trained for defense, for protecting Swiss soil, for fighting off invaders. You're expecting a conventional military briefing, maybe troop movements, defensive positions, standard wartime strategy. Instead, your commanding general looks you in the eye and says, "Gentlemen, if they come, we destroy everything. Not defeat the enemy, not hold the line, not fight them off. Destroy everything." Think about that for a second. Your own country, your own infrastructure, everything you've sworn to protect, and he's telling you to blow it all up. The room falls into stunned silence, because what General Guisan is describing isn't just military strategy. It's essentially ordering his own commanders to commit what could be considered treason against their homeland. Every bridge that connects Swiss communities, every tunnel that lets people travel through the mountains, every railway that brings supplies to Swiss families, every factory that employs Swiss workers. All of it. But here's what makes this moment so extraordinary. This wasn't some desperate, last-minute plan cooked up as German tanks rolled toward the border. This was the culmination of 7 years of the most methodical, most comprehensive preparation for self-destruction that any nation has ever undertaken. See, the Swiss had been watching Hitler since 1933, while other countries were trying to appease him, trying to negotiate with him, or simply hoping he'd go away. The Swiss were doing something completely different. They were preparing to make their entire country worthless to him. Since 1933, Swiss engineers had been secretly hollowing out their country like a piece of Swiss cheese. Except this cheese was packed with explosives. By 1939, a full year before that meeting at Rütli, 10,000 separate demolition points were ready and waiting. 10,000. Let that sink in for a moment. That's not military installations. That's not just strategic targets. That's everything. Every piece of infrastructure that makes a modern country function. The Gotthard Tunnel and ARD. And this is crucial to understand. The Gotthard Tunnel wasn't just some local Swiss transportation route. This was Europe's most important north-south artery. Everything moving between Germany and Italy had to go through this tunnel. It was like the main highway of European commerce and military supply. The Swiss had placed 400 pounds of TNT in hidden chambers throughout the tunnel. 400 pounds. Enough explosive to seal that tunnel for months, maybe years. But they didn't stop there. Every bridge crossing the Rhine River, these massive stone and steel structures that had taken years to build, had pre-chambered pillars. That means the Swiss had drilled holes into the support structures and prepared them for explosive charges. When the time came, it would take exactly 60 seconds to wire any of these bridges for complete destruction. Now, here's what makes this story absolutely incredible. This wasn't just military leadership imposing its will on terrified civilians. This was an entire population volunteering to help destroy their own country. Fritz Müller was a baker from Lucerne, a regular guy who made bread for his neighbors, who probably worried about normal things like flour prices and whether his ovens were hot enough. But Fritz Müller spent his weekends learning to calculate blast radii. He was studying the mathematics of destruction, figuring out exactly how much explosive it would take to bring down the bridge near his bakery. Maria Wegmann was a schoolteacher in the town of Sargans. She taught children their letters and numbers, helped them with arithmetic, read them stories. Maria Wegman memorized explosive placement diagrams. She knew exactly where to put charges to bring down the railway bridge that connected her town to the outside world. Think about what that means. An entire nation of clockmakers and chocolate artisans, of bankers and farmers, of people famous for precision and peace, had transformed themselves into demolition experts. And they did this willingly, eagerly even. Because here's the thing the Swiss understood that nobody else seemed to get. They looked at what had happened to Austria. They watched Germany simply walk into Austria and announce that it was now part of the German Reich. Austria's mountains didn't save them. Austria's culture didn't save them. Austria's desire to remain independent meant nothing. They saw what happened to Czechoslovakia, how Hitler had demanded the Sudetenland, promised that would be enough, then taken the entire country within months. Czechoslovakia had mountains too. They had defensive positions. They had a military. None of it mattered. The Swiss realized something that seems obvious now but was revolutionary then. In modern warfare, the value of conquering a country isn't in defeating its army. It's in gaining access to its resources, its infrastructure, its industrial capacity. So they asked themselves a simple question. What if we made sure there were no resources to gain? What if we made victory meaningless? When that meeting at Rutli ended, those commanders returned to their units with a message that would define Switzerland forever. Not, we will fight to the last man. Not, we will never surrender. But something far more radical. We will make invasion so costly that victory becomes meaningless. They were essentially telling Hitler, you can have our country, but you'll get nothing for it except rubble and problems. Now, you might be thinking this sounds like madness, and in a way, it was. The Swiss were preparing to do to themselves what their enemies wanted to do to them. They were planning to turn their beautiful, prosperous, carefully organized country into a wasteland. But here's the genius of it. They weren't just planning to destroy infrastructure. They were planning to make the very act of invasion so expensive, so complicated, so resource-intensive, that it would bankrupt whoever tried it. Because think about what happens when you invade a country and everything valuable has been destroyed. Suddenly you're not gaining resources. You're responsible for feeding and housing the population you've just conquered. You're responsible for rebuilding everything you need to make the occupation worthwhile. You've gone from gaining an asset to taking on a massive liability. The Swiss had done the math. They calculated exactly how much it would cost Germany to rebuild Swiss infrastructure, to restore Swiss transportation, to make Switzerland economically useful. The numbers were staggering. It would take more resources to make Switzerland valuable than Germany could ever hope to extract from it. But the psychological warfare was even more brilliant, because once word got out about Swiss preparations, and the Swiss made sure word got out, every German planner had to ask themselves, if the Swiss are willing to do this to their own country, what exactly are they willing to do to invading armies? This is where the story gets really wild, because the Swiss weren't just preparing to destroy their infrastructure, they were preparing to disappear their entire military into the mountains and fight the longest, most expensive guerrilla war in history. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because before we can understand how the Swiss planned to make invasion impossible, we need to go inside the mountains themselves. We need to see what they built in secret, what they carved out of solid rock, what they created in the depths of the Alps that would make every German general lose sleep at night. We need to talk about the fortress that nobody knew existed. The underground cities that could house entire armies. The weapon systems that could fire shells 20 miles through mountain valleys. The bunkers that could withstand direct hits from the largest bombs Germany had, because here's what the Germans didn't know as they planned their invasion of Switzerland. The Swiss hadn't just prepared to destroy their country, they had prepared to fight for it from inside the mountains themselves. They had turned the Alps into the largest, most sophisticated military installation the world had ever seen. And when German intelligence finally figured out what the Swiss had built, when they finally understood the true scope of Swiss preparations, the entire calculus of invasion changed forever. Deep inside Mount Sonnenberg, something extraordinary was happening. It's 1937, and 2,000 workers are laboring in absolute secrecy. They're not mining for gold or silver. They're not building a subway tunnel or a water system. They're carving out something that defies imagination. 2. A 7-story underground fortress from solid granite. Picture this with me. You're standing at what looks like an ordinary mountain face. Maybe there's a small door, the kind you'd expect to lead to a storage shed or maintenance facility. You open that door, and instead of a closet, you're staring into a cathedral-sized chamber carved from living rock. The ceiling disappears into darkness above you. The walls stretch out further than your flashlight can reach, and this is just the entrance. This fortress, and I want you to really visualize this, had its own power plant. Not a generator, a full industrial power plant capable of running a small city. It had its own water purification system that could turn mountain springs into drinking water for thousands of people. It had enough food stored in climate-controlled chambers to feed a full garrison for 3 years. 3 years. But here's the part that will blow your mind. The main gun chamber was large, enough to hold a cathedral. And inside this chamber, Swiss engineers had installed artillery pieces that could fire shells 20 miles. 20 miles. Through mountain valleys, with precision accuracy. Think about what that means tactically. An enemy army approaching through a Swiss valley would be under artillery fire from guns they couldn't see, couldn't locate, and couldn't reach. It would be like being attacked by the mountain itself. The ventilation system alone was an engineering marvel. 4 miles of piping, all hidden within natural rock formations. From the outside, you'd see nothing but mountain. But inside, fresh air was circulating through chambers that housed thousands of men. Massive generators, ammunition storage, command centers, hospitals, even sleeping quarters with actual beds. Now, Mount Sonnenberg was impressive. But here's what's really going to shock you. It was just one of 300 fortifications that transformed the Alps into the world's largest military installation. 300. Hidden fortresses carved into mountains across Switzerland. Each one designed to be completely invisible from the outside, completely self-sufficient on the inside, and absolutely devastating to any army unlucky enough to encounter them. Let me tell you about Sargans, because this one really shows you how the Swiss thought about defense. The engineers there created bunkers that could withstand direct hits from 2,000-pound bombs. Now, they didn't just design these theoretically, they actually tested them. They built prototypes and dropped actual 2,000-pound bombs on them to make sure they'd survive. Can you imagine being the engineer who had to sign off on that test? Well, we think it'll work. Let's drop a bomb on it and find out. The entrance to the Sargans fortress looked like an innocent barn door, just a regular wooden door set into what appeared to be a normal hillside building. You'd walk past it 100 times and never give it a second thought. But open that door, and you immediately faced what military planners call a killing zone. Interlocking machine guns positioned so that every inch of the entrance corridor could be hit by crossfire. These weren't ordinary machine guns. They could fire 1,800 rounds per minute. 1,800. In 60 seconds, they could put out more bullets than most soldiers fire in their entire military career. And that was just the first obstacle. Behind the killing zone were steel doors 4 feet thick. 4 feet of solid steel. You could hit those doors with tank shells and they'd barely dent. Behind those doors were gas-proof chambers, because the Swiss had thought about chemical weapons too. And behind those chambers was another killing zone. Then more steel doors. Then more defensive positions. It was like a deadly maze designed by people who really didn't want visitors. But here's what makes this even more incredible. These weren't just defensive positions. They were designed to be offensive weapons platforms. The Swiss could use these fortresses to project power across entire regions. An army trying to move through Swiss territory wouldn't just be avoiding Swiss defenders. They'd be running a gauntlet of hidden fortifications that could strike without warning from any direction. The numbers tell the whole story, and they're almost unbelievable. By 1940, Switzerland had more bunkers per square mile than any nation on Earth, more than Germany, more than the Soviet Union, more than anyone. But it wasn't just professional soldiers manning these fortifications. Every adult male in Switzerland kept a rifle and 200 rounds of ammunition at home, not in some centralized armory where it might be captured or destroyed, in their bedroom closet, next to their work clothes and family photos. 200 rounds per person. Do the math on that across the entire adult male population of Switzerland. We're talking about millions and millions of rounds of ammunition distributed throughout the civilian population, ready to be used at a moment's notice. And the training was just as comprehensive as the preparation. Swiss children learned to identify aircraft silhouettes before they learned multiplication tables. Think about that. While kids in other countries were learning to recognize different types of birds, Swiss children were learning to tell the difference between German bombers and Allied fighters. Women practiced assembling Molotov cocktails as part of civil defense training. Housewives who spent their days cooking and cleaning and caring for children were learning to turn household chemicals into weapons. The Swiss had turned their entire population into a potential military force. One British military observer who visited Switzerland in 1939 wrote something that I think perfectly captures what the Swiss had accomplished. He said, "Visiting Switzerland is like discovering your quiet neighbor has turned their house into a doomsday bunker. 12. Then realizing every house on the street has done the same." But the psychological impact was just as important as the physical defenses, because once you understand what the Swiss had built, you start to realize what it would mean to actually try to conquer this country. You wouldn't just be fighting the Swiss army. You'd be fighting an entire population that had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. Every farmer would be a potential sniper. Every village would be a potential fortress. Every mountain pass would be a potential killing ground. And here's the thing that really made German military planners lose sleep. The Swiss hadn't just prepared their military and their population, they had prepared their geography. See, Switzerland is basically one big natural fortress to begin with. It's surrounded by mountains, with only a few ways in or out. The Swiss had taken this natural advantage and weaponized it. Every pass that an army might use to enter Switzerland was now a carefully prepared killing ground. Every valley that looked like a safe route of advance was actually a trap, but the real genius was in how they'd integrated all of these defenses. The hidden fortresses weren't just scattered randomly around the country. They were positioned to support each other, to create overlapping fields of fire, to make sure that any attacking force would be under constant threat from multiple directions. It was like a chess game where the Swiss controlled the entire board, and every piece was hidden until the moment it struck. And remember, all of this was happening while Switzerland maintained its famous neutrality. They weren't threatening anyone. They weren't building an offensive military force. They were simply making it clear that conquest would be so expensive, so complicated, so resource-intensive, that rational enemies would choose easier targets. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Because while the Swiss were building this incredible defensive system, Adolf Hitler was making his own plans. And in August of 1940, those plans had a name: Operation Tannenbaum, the plan to conquer Switzerland. On paper, it looked simple enough. 11 German divisions sweeping through Switzerland in a massive pincer movement. Italy would attack from the south with 4 divisions. Total conquest in 3 weeks, maybe 4. But when German generals started looking at the details, when they really examined what conquering Switzerland would require, they discovered something that would change everything. They discovered that the Swiss had prepared for this exact scenario, and their preparations were beyond anything the German military had ever encountered. The meeting where they briefed Hitler on Operation Tannenbaum became the moment when the mathematics of warfare collided with the reality of Swiss preparation. And what happened in that meeting would determine whether Switzerland would survive the war as an independent nation or disappear from the map forever. August 19th, 1940. Adolf Hitler's mountain retreat at Berghof. The setting is almost peaceful. Alpine views, crisp mountain air, the kind of scenery that usually puts people in a good mood. But inside the conference room, General Franz Halder is about to ruin Hitler's day completely. Halder unfolds the maps for Operation Tannenbaum, the code name for Germany's plan to invade Switzerland. And you know what? On paper, it looks beautiful. Clean lines sweeping across the map. 11 German divisions moving in a coordinated pincer movement from the north and northeast. 4 Italian divisions attacking from the south. Arrows pointing toward major Swiss cities. Classic military planning. Hitler is probably feeling pretty good at this point. After all, this is August 1940. Germany has just conquered France in 6 weeks. Poland fell in 4 weeks. Denmark took 6 hours. 6 hours. The German military machine seems unstoppable. So when Hitler looks at this map of tiny Switzerland, he's probably thinking, how hard can this be? Then, General Halder starts explaining the details. And very quickly, the room grows quiet. First problem, Halder begins, and you can probably hear the reluctance in his voice because he knows this isn't what Hitler wants to hear. The Swiss can mobilize 850,000 troops in 48 hours. Let that sink in for a moment. 850,000 troops. That's more than Germany used to conquer France. France. One of the major powers of Europe, with a massive military, modern equipment, extensive fortifications, and tiny Switzerland could field more defenders than Germany had needed attackers to defeat France. But the math gets so much worse from there. See, there are basic principles of military science that you can't ignore, no matter how successful you've been. And one of those principles is that in mountain warfare, attackers need overwhelming numerical superiority, not just more troops. Overwhelming superiority. The textbooks say 10 to 1. For every defender, you need 10 attackers. That's not some theoretical number that academics made up. That's based on centuries of mountain warfare, on hard-won experience about what it actually takes to dislodge defenders who know the terrain and have prepared positions. So let's do the math that General Halder had to do in that conference room. 850,000 Swiss defenders times 10 equals 8.5 million German troops required for invasion. 8.5 million. That was more than Germany's entire military. More than they had available for all theatres of war combined. More than they could possibly deploy to any single operation. But even if Germany had 8.5 million troops available, here's the next problem. Where exactly would they put them? Switzerland isn't like the plains of Poland where you can deploy massive mechanized formations. Switzerland is mountains and valleys, narrow passes and choke points, the kind of terrain where a single machine gun position can hold up an entire division. Those German mechanized divisions that had been so devastatingly effective in Poland and France, the tanks and armored vehicles that had revolutionized warfare, completely useless on mountain paths, where pack mules move faster than panzers. Picture a German tank commander who spent months perfecting the art of rapid advance across open terrain, suddenly finding himself on a mountain road so narrow that one disabled vehicle blocks the entire advance, where the enemy can roll boulders down from above, where a single well-placed explosive can create a landslide that takes weeks to clear. This is the moment where modern military doctrine meets ancient geographic reality, and geography wins. But General Halder isn't finished delivering bad news, because the really devastating information is yet to come. Captain Wilhelm Werder had spent weeks secretly photographing Swiss defences. This wasn't easy work. The Swiss were famously paranoid about security, but Werder was good at his job, and he'd managed to get detailed intelligence about what the Swiss had actually built. His findings were presented to the room like a medical diagnosis of terminal illness. Every major bridge was pre-chambered for demolition, not just prepared for destruction, but actually fitted with explosive chambers and wired for immediate detonation. German engineering units wouldn't need to fight their way to Swiss bridges to destroy them. The Swiss could blow them up faster than the Germans could reach them. Every tunnel entrance had built-in explosive chambers. The Swiss had literally built destruction into their infrastructure. It wasn't an afterthought or a desperate measure. It was engineered into the original construction. But here's where it gets really wild. The Swiss had aircraft hidden in highway tunnels. Think about that. You're a German pilot flying reconnaissance over Switzerland, looking for airfields to bomb. You see highways, maybe some traffic. What you don't see is that some of those highway tunnels actually contain Swiss fighter planes, ready to emerge and attack without warning. Fake chalets, concealing anti-tank guns. Buildings that looked like innocent mountain lodges, but were actually military positions with enough firepower to destroy entire armored columns. Entire fake villages that were actually artillery positions, complete with fake houses, fake streets, fake civilian activity, all designed to draw attacking forces into carefully prepared killing zones. The intelligence report painted a picture of a country that had turned itself into one massive military deception. Nothing was what it appeared to be. Every piece of seemingly civilian infrastructure was potentially a military asset. Every innocent-looking building could be a fortress. The final assessment was brutal in its mathematical precision. Switzerland would require more resources to conquer than the Soviet Union, more resources than invading Russia, which was already being planned as Germany's next major operation. But here's the kicker. While conquering the Soviet Union would provide vast resources, raw materials, agricultural land, industrial capacity, Switzerland would provide virtually nothing. Even if Germany succeeded in conquest, they'd be left with a destroyed infrastructure, a hostile population, and mountains full of hidden fortifications that could continue resistance indefinitely. One general in that meeting muttered what everyone was thinking. We'd be feeding 5 million troops through destroyed infrastructure to capture a country that would blow up anything useful before we arrived. Think about the psychology of that moment. These are the same generals who had just achieved the most spectacular military victories in modern history. They had rewritten the rules of warfare. They had made the impossible look easy. And here they are, staring at a map of tiny Switzerland and realizing that everything that had made them successful would work against them in this terrain, against this enemy, in this kind of warfare. But Hitler wasn't ready to give up. He was still thinking like a man who had conquered most of Europe in less than 2 years. Switzerland was small. Germany was powerful. There had to be a way. So the planning continued. But every scenario they examined led to the same conclusion. Switzerland had prepared for this exact invasion, and their preparations were unlike anything the German military had ever encountered. The Swiss had studied German tactics in Poland and France. They understood how German combined arms operations worked. They knew about blitzkrieg, about air-ground coordination, about the importance of rapid advance and maintaining momentum. And they had designed their entire defense specifically to neutralize every German advantage. German air power? The Swiss had dispersed their assets and prepared hidden airfields. German mechanized units? The terrain channeled them into kill zones. German logistics? Every supply route would be under constant attack from hidden positions. The more the Germans studied Swiss preparations, the more they realized that Switzerland had turned itself into a military puzzle with no solution. Every approach they considered led to the same result: massive casualties, enormous resource expenditure, and questionable strategic gain. But the story gets even more interesting, because while German generals were struggling with the mathematics of invasion, Swiss pilots were about to demonstrate exactly why Operation Tannenbaum would be more than just expensive. It would be a disaster. In the skies above Switzerland, a series of air battles was about to unfold that would show Hitler's Air Force commanders exactly what they'd be facing. And what they discovered would make every previous concern about Swiss defences seem optimistic. June 4th, 1940. The sky above Zurich is a perfect blue, the kind of day when you'd rather be hiking in the mountains than thinking about war. But Lieutenant Franz Strafe, flying patrol in his Messerschmitt fighter, spots something that makes his blood run cold. 3 German bombers crossing into Swiss airspace without permission. Now here's what makes this moment so incredible. That Messerschmitt fighter that Lieutenant Strafe is flying, Switzerland bought it from Germany, just months earlier. The Swiss had literally purchased German aircraft to use against the Germans. And Lieutenant Strafe himself? He's not some hotshot career military pilot with years of combat experience. In civilian life, Franz Strafe makes furniture. He's a carpenter who spends his weekdays crafting tables and chairs, who probably worries about wood grain and varnish quality. But as those German bombers cross into Swiss territory, something extraordinary happens. This furniture maker turns into one of the most effective combat pilots in European airspace. The engagement lasts 10 minutes. 10 minutes of aerial combat that seems impossible when you know the details. Lieutenant Streif, in his German-built fighter, shoots down a state-of-the-art Heinkel bomber flown by experienced Luftwaffe crew. The German crew never saw him coming, but here's the really wild part. This wasn't a fluke. Over the next 6 weeks, Swiss pilots destroyed 11 German aircraft while losing just 3 of their own. 11-3, against the Luftwaffe. The same air force that had dominated the skies over Poland, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. So how is that possible? How do part-time pilots flying equipment bought from their enemies achieve that kind of success against the most experienced air force in the world? The secret wasn't in their aircraft. It wasn't in their training, at least not conventional military training. The secret was that these weren't really military pilots at all. They were watchmakers and farmers and bank clerks who spent their weekends flying in the Alps. Think about what that means. While Luftwaffe pilots were learning to fly over the flat plains of northern Germany, Swiss pilots were learning to navigate the most challenging airspace in Europe. Every weekend, every holiday, every spare moment, they were up in the mountains learning to read air currents that could flip an aircraft upside down without warning. They knew every mountain pass, every place where winds converged, every spot where clouds formed at different times of day. They understood how altitude affected engine performance in ways that pilots trained at sea level couldn't imagine. Captain Max Müller, SID, and I love this detail, was a cheese merchant in civilian life. This is a guy who spent his days worrying about dairy prices and aging processes. But Captain Max Müller developed what became known as the Alpine Spiral, a combat maneuver that used the unique conditions of mountain flying to devastating effect. Here's how it worked. Müller would climb above German formations in the thin mountain air where Luftwaffe pilots, trained at lower altitudes, struggled to maintain consciousness. The Germans literally couldn't breathe properly at the altitudes where Swiss pilots operated comfortably. Then Müller would dive through the German formation with guns blazing, using gravity and mountain geography to achieve speeds that level flight combat couldn't match. And before the Germans could react, he'd disappear into valleys too narrow for pursuit, using terrain knowledge that took years to develop. The Germans were fighting in an environment they didn't understand, against pilots who had turned that environment into a weapon. But the psychological impact was even more devastating than tactical success. Hitler's response to these air battles was volcanic. On June 20th, he personally ordered immediate preparations for invasion of Switzerland. Think about that. The leader of Nazi Germany, the man who had conquered most of Europe, was so enraged by Swiss pilots shooting down German aircraft that he wanted to invade immediately. Not as part of some grand strategic plan, but because Swiss furniture makers and cheese merchants were embarrassing the Luftwaffe. But his generals talked him down with cold, hard facts that were even more disturbing than the air battle losses. Those Swiss pilots who were causing so much trouble, they had hundreds of hidden airstrips, not major air bases that could be bombed into oblivion, but mountain meadows with camouflaged fuel dumps, highway stretches that could serve as runways, valley floors that looked empty but could be operational airfields within hours. Even if Germany achieved complete air superiority over Switzerland's conventional airfields, Swiss fighters could operate from highways, hidden in tunnels between missions, emerging to attack and disappearing again before German forces could respond. General Albert Kesselring, one of Germany's most experienced air commanders, later admitted something that really shows you how much the Swiss air battles changed German thinking. He said, "We could have destroyed their air force in a week, but in those mountains, with those pilots, we'd still be fighting partisans in the air for years." Partisans in the air. Think about what that means. Not just conventional air battles between military formations, but guerrilla warfare in 3 dimensions. Swiss pilots striking without warning from hidden bases, using mountain terrain like ground-based guerrillas use forests and villages. But the air battles revealed something even more important about Swiss strategy. The Swiss weren't trying to win air superiority. They weren't trying to defeat the Luftwaffe in conventional terms. They were trying to make air operations over Switzerland so expensive, so complicated, so dangerous, that the Germans would decide it wasn't worth the cost. And it was working. Every German aircraft shot down represented not just the loss of expensive equipment, but the loss of experienced aircrew that took months to replace. Every mission over Switzerland required additional escorts, additional fuel, additional planning. What should have been routine operations became major undertakings. The Swiss had turned their airspace into a resource drain. German aircraft entering Swiss territory might complete their missions, but they'd pay a price that made those missions increasingly questionable from a strategic standpoint. But the air battles were just the beginning of Swiss resistance that German planners hadn't anticipated, because while Swiss pilots were proving that even the Luftwaffe could be challenged, Swiss bankers were conducting an economic war that was even more sophisticated than their military preparations. And this economic warfare involved something that seems almost impossible to believe. The Swiss were using Nazi money to fund anti-Nazi operations. They were literally taking German deposits and using them to finance resistance movements across Europe. It was economic jiu-jitsu on a scale that had never been attempted before, and it worked because the Germans couldn't attack Swiss banks without destroying their own assets. The more you understand about Swiss strategy during World War II, the more you realize that they had thought through every possible angle. Military, economic, psychological, diplomatic, every aspect of warfare had been considered and prepared for, and the Germans were beginning to understand that invasion of Switzerland wouldn't just be expensive in terms of troops and equipment. It would be expensive in ways that conventional military planning couldn't even calculate. Here's where the Swiss story gets really complicated. Because while Swiss soldiers were preparing to blow up their own country and Swiss pilots were shooting down German aircraft, Swiss bankers were playing the most dangerous financial game in history. By 1941, Swiss banks held approximately 500 million francs in German assets. 500 million francs. In today's money, we're talking about billions of dollars. German money, sitting in Swiss vaults, earning Swiss banks enormous profits. But here's the twisted genius of it. The Germans couldn't attack Switzerland without destroying their own money. Think about that for a moment. You're Adolf Hitler. You're planning to invade a country, but that country is holding massive amounts of your nation's wealth. If you attack, if you bomb Swiss cities, if you turn Switzerland into a battlefield, you're not just fighting the Swiss military, you're destroying your own financial assets. It's like planning to rob a bank where you keep your own savings account. But the story gets so much deeper and so much more morally complex than simple financial blackmail, because those famous numbered Swiss accounts, they weren't just hiding Nazi gold, they were also hiding Allied intelligence funds. Account number 251996 belonged to a British intelligence operation. Account 189423 was funding French resistance activities. The Swiss were literally using their banking system to run multiple sides of the war simultaneously. Let me tell you about Johann Wehrli, because his story really shows you the impossible moral position that Swiss bankers found themselves in. Johann was a manager at a major Zurich bank, and part of his job was processing gold bars that came from German sources. Some of those gold bars still had dental work melted into them. Dental work from concentration camp victims. Johann knew exactly what he was handling. He could see the evidence of horror melted down into neat, stackable ingots. But here's the part that makes this story so complicated. In the vault next door, Johann's colleague Karl Hoffmann was managing accounts that had smuggled 40,000 Jewish refugees to safety. 40,000 people. The money for those rescue operations came from fees that were secretly skimmed from Nazi transactions. So the same bank, on the same day, was handling blood money from the Holocaust and using German deposits to save Holocaust victims. The Swiss justified this as survival economics. Without German coal and food imports, Switzerland would starve within 6 months. They had no choice but to maintain economic relationships with Germany. but they were using those relationships to maintain the independence they needed to resist German pressure. Economists now call this the paradox of complicity, doing business with evil to maintain the power to resist evil. And the numbers are staggering. Swiss banks handled 80% of Nazi gold transactions. 80%. $20 billion in today's money flowing through Swiss banking systems, much of it stolen from conquered nations and murdered victims. But those same Swiss banks also held Allied accounts worth even more money. They had created intelligence networks that warned Allied forces about German operations. They were funding resistance movements across occupied Europe. One American intelligence officer wrote something that I think perfectly captures the moral complexity of Swiss banking during the war. He said, "The Swiss have turned moral compromise into a science. They'll take anyone's money, then use it against them. It's brilliant and repulsive simultaneously." But the Swiss weren't just passive participants in this financial war. They were actively manipulating it for strategic advantage. Here's how it worked. German industries needed Swiss precision machinery, Swiss chemicals, Swiss technical expertise. But the Swiss required payment in gold or hard currency, not German marks. This meant that Germany had to keep substantial reserves in Swiss banks to maintain trade relationships. The more dependent Germany became on Swiss trade, the more German assets were held hostage by Swiss neutrality. It was economic entanglement designed to make Swiss invasion financially catastrophic for Germany. And remember, this is happening while Germany is fighting the most expensive war in history. Every gold reserve matters. Every financial asset is crucial. The Germans couldn't afford to lose the resources they had stored in Switzerland, but they also couldn't access those resources if they attacked Switzerland. The Swiss had created what military strategists call a financial fortress. Their banking system had become as important to their defense as their mountain bunkers. But the psychological warfare was even more sophisticated, because the Swiss made sure that German leaders knew exactly how much German money was at risk. They weren't subtle about it. Swiss bankers would casually mention to German trade representatives how unfortunate it would be if military action disrupted banking operations. It was polite, diplomatic blackmail on a massive scale. And it worked because the Germans were trapped by their own success. They had conquered so much territory, stolen so much wealth, that they needed Swiss banks to manage and launder their assets. The very thing that made them powerful also made them dependent on Swiss cooperation. But here's what makes this story even more incredible. The Swiss weren't just manipulating German money. They were doing the same thing to every major power involved in the war. American assets in Swiss banks gave the United States a stake in Swiss survival. British intelligence funds meant that Swiss banking security was tied to British security interests. Even Soviet gold reserves were being held in Swiss accounts, creating Soviet interest in Swiss independence. The Swiss had made themselves financially indispensable to everyone. No major power could afford to see Switzerland destroyed because they all had too much at stake in Swiss financial institutions. It was like being the neutral party in a poker game where everyone has left their money with you for safekeeping. Nobody can flip the table without losing their own chips. But the moral cost was enormous. Swiss bankers were handling the financial evidence of some of the worst crimes in human history. They were profiting from genocide while also funding rescue operations. They were maintaining the very neutrality that allowed them to help Holocaust victims by doing business with the perpetrators of the Holocaust. There's no clean moral position in that situation. Every choice involved compromise with evil for the possibility of doing good, and the Swiss knew it. Internal bank documents from this period show that Swiss financial leaders understood exactly what they were involved in. They weren't naive about the source of Nazi gold or the purpose of German payments. They were making calculated decisions about acceptable moral costs for strategic survival. One Swiss banker wrote in his private diary, "We handle the devil's money to maintain the independence to fight the devil. God help us all." But the strategy worked. By 1942, attacking Switzerland would have meant destroying financial assets belonging to every major power in the world. The Swiss had made their destruction economically catastrophic for everyone, including their potential enemies. They had weaponized their banking system more effectively than any military technology. And this brings us to the ultimate question that German planners were facing by late 1940. Even if they could solve the military problems of invading Switzerland, even if they could accept the enormous casualties and resource expenditure, what would they actually gain? The answer to that question requires us to walk through invasion day hour by hour, to see exactly what would have happened if Hitler had decided that Swiss independence was worth any cost to eliminate. Because when you understand the full scope of Swiss preparations, when you see how every aspect of their strategy was designed to make victory meaningless, you begin to understand why Operation Tannenbaum was ultimately cancelled. The Swiss had prepared for the longest, most expensive military disaster in German history, and they were ready to make that disaster happen. Let's walk through Invasion Day. Let's see exactly what would have happened if Adolf Hitler had decided that Swiss independence was worth any cost to eliminate. Because when you understand the full scope of Swiss preparations, you begin to see why Operation Tannenbaum was ultimately cancelled. It's 6 a.m. on Invasion Day. The date doesn't matter. This scenario was planned to be identical whether it happened in 1940, 1941, or any other time during the war. German forces are massing at three main border crossings: Basel in the north, near the Rhine River, Schaffhausen in the northeast, and a southern approach coordinated with Italian forces. The German plan is elegant in its simplicity. 11 divisions of the Wehrmacht's finest troops, including mountain warfare specialists who had proven themselves in Norway. Massive artillery support, air cover from the Luftwaffe. A classic pincer movement designed to split Swiss forces and capture major population centres within days. At 6 a.m., the first German reconnaissance units cross the border. 6:15 a.m. Swiss border guards retreat after firing exactly one volley. Just one. This isn't cowardice. It's the signal for general mobilization. That single volley, heard across 3 different border stations, means that every Swiss citizen with military training should report to their assigned positions immediately. And here's where the first surprise hits German commanders. Within minutes of that signal, Swiss roads are clogged with civilian vehicles heading in all directions. But this isn't panic evacuation. This is the most organized military mobilization in European history. Remember those 850,000 Swiss troops that General Halder had warned about? They're not sitting in barracks, waiting for orders. They're farmers and shopkeepers and teachers who keep their military equipment at home. They're driving their own cars to predetermined positions that they've practiced reaching dozens of times. By 6:30 a.m., explosions are rippling across Switzerland like a deadly fireworks display. 400 bridges disappear in carefully orchestrated destruction. Not random demolition, DPAM, precision engineering that seals specific routes while leaving others open for Swiss use. The Gotthard Tunnel, that crucial north-south artery, takes the most spectacular hit. 400 pounds of TNT detonates simultaneously in multiple chambers, bringing down thousands of tons of rock. The tunnel that took decades to build is sealed for months, maybe years. Every major railway line is cut in multiple places. Not just the tracks, the Swiss have destroyed bridges, tunnels, switching stations, repair facilities. The entire transportation network that would be needed to supply German forces disappears in 30 minutes. By 7 a.m., every fuel depot in border regions is burning. The Swiss had identified every strategic resource that an occupying army would need and methodically destroyed it all. German forces advancing into Switzerland find themselves in a country with no functional infrastructure. The German advance, planned for 50 miles on the first day, manages 3 miles. 3 miles through terrain that becomes more deadly with every step. Let's follow one German mountain division as it advances towards Sargans. These are elite troops, specially trained for alpine warfare. They've studied Swiss terrain. They understand mountain combat. They're as prepared as any force could be, but they're not prepared for what actually happens. The first indication that something is wrong comes when their lead scouts simply disappear. No gunfire, no radio contact, no sign of struggle. 12 experienced soldiers just vanish in a valley that looks completely empty. The division commander decides to investigate with a full company, ID 150 men moving in careful formation through what appears to be open terrain. They're following standard mountain warfare doctrine, maintaining proper spacing, watching for obvious ambush sites. Then the mountain starts shooting at them. Artillery shells begin falling from positions they can't see, can't locate, can't return fire against. The shells are coming from inside the mountain itself, from gun positions carved into solid rock and invisible from any external observation. But that's just the beginning. Machine gun fire erupts from positions that look like natural rock formations. Anti-tank rounds destroy their vehicles from fake chalets that seemed like innocent mountain buildings. Swiss soldiers appear from caves and hidden bunkers, fire with deadly accuracy, then disappear again before German forces can respond. Within hours, this elite mountain division has taken casualties that would be heavy for a major battle, and they've advanced maybe 1 mile into Swiss territory. But here's what makes it truly nightmarish for the German commanders. They're not fighting the Swiss army. They're fighting Swiss civilians who happen to be better trained and equipped than most professional soldiers. The baker from Lucerne, who spent weekends learning blast calculations, is now putting that knowledge to devastating use. Fritz Müller has turned every building in his town into a potential explosive trap. German forces entering Lucerne find that every house might be booby-trapped, every cellar might contain hidden defenders, every innocent doorway might conceal a machine gun position. Maria Wegmann, the schoolteacher who memorized explosive placement diagrams, is now leading children and elderly residents through mountain paths to safety, while simultaneously directing artillery fire against German positions. She knows every trail, every hiding place, every spot where natural features can be turned into defensive advantages. Week 1 unfolds like a nightmare for German forces. These are the same troops who conquered Poland in 4 weeks, France in 6 weeks. They're accustomed to rapid advance, to enemy forces breaking under pressure, to populations surrendering when faced with overwhelming military superiority. Instead, they find themselves fighting ghosts. Swiss soldiers know every cave, every deer path, every spot where fog forms at dawn. They strike from concealed positions, inflict casualties, then melt away before German forces can respond. When Germans move to investigate attack sites, they find empty mountains that look like they've been empty for centuries. German casualty reports from this first week describe wounds from weapons that shouldn't exist in modern warfare. Museum piece rifles from the 1800s, loaded with modern ammunition, hunting weapons modified to fire homemade explosives, even crossbows firing dynamite-tipped bolts. One frustrated German officer writes in his diary, "We captured a village defended by a grandfather with a hunting rifle. It cost us 37 men. When we searched the village, we found children's toys and family photographs, but no military equipment except that one rifle. How do you fight an enemy where every civilian is potentially a soldier?" But the real psychological impact comes from the nature of Swiss resistance. These aren't desperate last stands by cornered troops. These are carefully planned operations by people defending their own homes, their own communities, their own families. Every Swiss defender knows exactly why they're fighting and exactly what they're protecting. German soldiers, fighting far from home in terrain they don't understand, begin to question what they're trying to accomplish. By the end of week 2, German forces control perhaps 10% of Swiss territory, all of it deliberately destroyed before capture. Every building they occupy has been stripped of anything useful. Every well has been poisoned. Every food store has been removed or contaminated. The Swiss have turned conquered territory into a liability rather than an asset. Month 3 presents German commanders with mathematics that make continued operations almost impossible. Wehrmacht casualties are approaching 100,000, more than the entire French campaign. They control perhaps 20% of Swiss territory, but that territory provides no strategic value. The Swiss redoubt, EA, the Alpine fortress system, remains completely untouched. All the hidden bunkers, all the mountain artillery positions, all the underground command centers are still operational. German forces haven't even been able to locate most of them, much less attack them. Food supplies in German-controlled areas are exhausted. The Swiss had systematically removed or destroyed everything that an occupying army would need to sustain itself. German forces are entirely dependent on supply lines that are under constant attack from Swiss partisans. And now winter is coming. Mountain warfare in snow doesn't just double casualties, it transforms the entire nature of military operations. Supply convoys that struggle through mountain passes in summer become impossible in winter conditions. Vehicles break down in temperatures that Swiss defenders, fighting from heated bunkers, handle easily. Wehrmacht calculations show they need 3 million tons of supplies monthly to maintain operations in Switzerland. But bombed railways and destroyed roads can move maybe 100,000 tons. The mathematics of logistics make continued operations unsustainable. The invasion has become what military historians call victory disease, winning individual battles while losing the strategic war. By month 6, if German forces somehow managed to continue operations, they would face the ultimate Swiss weapon, icy time itself. Every day of occupation costs enormous resources. Every week requires more troops, more supplies, more equipment. The Swiss have turned their country into a military black hole that consumes German resources without providing any strategic benefit. German planners finally understand what the Swiss had been preparing for since 1933. Not victory in conventional terms, but making defeat so expensive that enemies choose other targets. The Swiss had weaponized their own destruction. And that brings us to the real genius of Swiss strategy. They didn't just survive World War II. They created a model of defense that would reshape military thinking for generations. The concept was elegantly simple. Make conquest so expensive that rational enemies choose other targets. But the implications went far beyond Switzerland itself. What the Swiss had proven would change the entire nature of warfare in the modern world. Switzerland emerged from World War II with something unprecedented in military history, a model of defense that would reshape global thinking about warfare, deterrence, and national survival. What they had created went far beyond bunkers and explosives. They had proven that the nature of victory itself could be redefined. The concept was elegantly simple. Make conquest so expensive that rational enemies choose other targets. By 1960, over a dozen nations had studied the Swiss model and adapted it to their own circumstances. The influence was profound and far-reaching in ways that most people never realize. Israel's entire defense doctrine comes directly from Swiss thinking. The idea that a small nation surrounded by larger, hostile neighbors can maintain independence through making invasion too costly to contemplate. That's pure Swiss strategy. When Israeli military planners developed their defensive positions in the Golan Heights, when they designed their mobilization systems, when they created their civil defense networks, they were following blueprints written in the Swiss Alps. Finland's total defense concept against potential Soviet invasion. That's Swiss strategy adapted to forests instead of mountains. The Finns studied how the Swiss had integrated civilian and military preparation, how they had turned their entire population into a defensive asset, how they had made their geography into a weapon. But the psychological breakthrough was even more important than the tactical innovations. Switzerland proved that neutrality doesn't mean pacifism. It means being so thoroughly prepared for war that nobody wants to test you. And here's what's really remarkable. Switzerland didn't abandon this approach when the war ended. They doubled down on it. Today, Switzerland maintains bunkers for 114% of its population. Read that again. 114%. They can shelter their entire country, plus refugees. Every Swiss citizen has an assigned place in a nuclear-hardened bunker system that makes their World War II preparations look modest. Every highway bridge built since 1960 includes demolition chambers, not as an afterthought, but as part of the original engineering specifications. Swiss construction crews install the infrastructure for destruction, while they're building the infrastructure for commerce. Military service remains universal. Every Swiss male serves in the military and keeps his rifle at home after service. This isn't some ceremonial tradition. It's a living reminder that every Swiss citizen is part of the national defense system. The rifle culture continues and has actually expanded. Swiss shooting clubs have 300,000 active members. That's roughly 1 in 25 Swiss citizens who regularly practice marksmanship. For comparison, that would be like having 12 million Americans actively training with military-style weapons. But the numbers become truly staggering when you look at modern Swiss civil defense preparations. Switzerland spends more per capita on civil defense than America spends on homeland security, more per capita than Russia spends on internal security, more than any other nation on Earth. They maintain 17,000 bunkers, 17,000, hidden command centers, supply depots, weapons storage facilities, communications hubs, medical facilities, all of it designed to function independently for years if necessary. 2,000 hospitals, hidden in mountains, not field hospitals or temporary facilities, fully equipped medical centers carved into granite with surgical suites, intensive care capabilities, pharmaceutical stockpiles, and staff housing. Enough food stockpiled to feed the entire Swiss population for 2 years. Not basic survival rations, post-complete nutritional requirements for 8.5 million people for 24 months. The logistics of maintaining that food supply, rotating stock to prevent spoilage, ensuring proper distribution systems, represents one of the most sophisticated civil defense operations in the world. When people ask Swiss officials why they maintain such extensive preparations in what appears to be a peaceful world, the answers reveal how deeply Swiss strategic thinking has been shaped by their World War II experience. Swiss Defense Minister Ueli Maurer gave what I think is the perfect explanation. He said, "Our fathers were ready to destroy their country rather than surrender it. That willingness is our true defense. The bunkers and bombs are just reminders." Think about that statement. The physical preparations, all those bunkers, all those weapons, all those stockpiles, those aren't really the defense system. They're symbols of something deeper. They're proof that the Swiss remain willing to make conquest worthless. But the Swiss model has evolved beyond simple military deterrence. In a world of cyber warfare, economic manipulation, and information operations, Switzerland has adapted their principles to new kinds of threats. Swiss banking secrecy laws, Swiss data protection regulations, Swiss neutrality in international conflicts, AAT. These are all modern applications of the same strategic thinking that created the Alpine fortress. Make yourself too valuable to destroy, too expensive to conquer, too useful to eliminate. The Swiss host international organizations, not just for diplomatic prestige, but because those organizations create global stakeholders in Swiss independence. Attack Switzerland, and you're attacking the International Red Cross, the World Health Organization, dozens of UN agencies, countless international corporations. It's the same strategy they used during World War II, adapted to modern realities. Make your destruction costly for everyone, not just your enemies, and the model keeps spreading. South Korea's tunnel systems under Seoul follow Swiss engineering principles. Taiwan's civil defense preparations borrow heavily from Swiss mobilization concepts. Even NATO planning for defense of the Baltic states includes elements of Swiss-inspired porcupine strategy. But perhaps the most important legacy of Swiss World War II preparations is philosophical. They proved that military superiority doesn't guarantee strategic success, that small nations can maintain independence against overwhelming odds, that the willingness to accept destruction can be more powerful than the ability to inflict destruction. In our current world of smart weapons and precision strikes, of cyber attacks and economic warfare, Switzerland's lesson endures. The best defense isn't the ability to win wars, it's the ability to make victory worthless. And that principle has implications far beyond military strategy. In business, in diplomacy, in personal relationships, the Swiss have demonstrated that sometimes the most effective response to overwhelming force is to make sure that force gains nothing by succeeding. The mountains of Switzerland still hide their secrets. The bunkers remain stocked and ready. The Swiss population still trains for scenarios that most people hope will never happen. and Swiss political leaders still make decisions based on principles developed when their nation faced extinction. Because they understand something that the rest of the world is still learning, in a complex, interconnected world, true security doesn't come from the ability to defeat your enemies. It comes from making sure your enemies have no rational reason to try. The Swiss turned their country into a fortress. But more than that, they turned the very idea of conquest into a losing proposition, and in doing so, they may have created the most important military innovation of the modern era. Not a new weapon or a new tactic, but a new way of thinking about what victory means and what defeat costs. That's the real legacy of Switzerland's World War II preparations. Not just the survival of one small nation, but a blueprint for how any nation, any organization, any individual can maintain independence in a world where traditional defenses might not be enough. The Swiss proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon is the willingness to ensure that nobody can profit from your defeat. And that lesson is as relevant today as it was in 1940, when General Henri Guisan stood in that meadow and told his commanders to prepare to destroy everything rather than surrender anything. The fortress that changed everything wasn't built of stone and steel. It was built of an idea that freedom protected by the willingness to sacrifice, everything is freedom that can never be taken away. And that idea, more than any bunker or any weapon, is what kept Switzerland free when freedom seemed impossible.